let's lay out the sample plots on the map, for each stand, that uses a cruising method, that is based on plots or strips. The first step is to use the Create Grid utility, to generate a set of regularly spaced lines, or points, across the stand. Open the Cruise A map file, and zoom to the stand's topic. Select the first stand, which is named S001 Cruise 01. We will be cruising this stand by using the strips method. For this stand, assume that the land slopes up from the river, at a bearing of about north 30 degrees east. We will run the sample strips, up and down the slope. Select Utilities Create Grid. We will do a 20% cruise, spacing 1 chain wide strips, 5 chains apart. The baseline for the stand is about 2,310 feet, which converts to about 35 chains. Therefore, we can put in 7 strips. The strips will be laid out in such a way that the first and the last strips will be 2.5 chains, or 165 feet, from their nearest boundary of the stand. The distance between the strip centers will be 330 feet. We will place their grid origin at the southwest corner of the stand, assuming that it has been tied to a primary control. We will accept the setting of 30 degrees for the orientation field. Select the Lines option. Then select X direction. In the Scale section, enter 330 into the X direction field. Make sure the distance is displayed in feet. Click the Preview button to see the lines created by the program. Since we want the strips to be 165 feet from the exterior boundaries, we should shift the grid lines along the X direction by that distance. To do so, mark the Offset checkbox, and enter the value 165 into the X Offset Data field. Mark the Create Lines from Grid checkbox. By default, the Grid Lines topic is selected as the topic to use. Click the Preview button again, to see what we will be getting. Click the OK button to create a line feature at each grid line. These will serve as the center line of the cruise strips. Since I don't need the grid mesh anymore, I will select it, and use the Cut tool to delete it. Stand number 2 in the Cruise A map will be cruised by using the 100% tally method. This sampling method is based on trees, rather than plots. Therefore, we do not need to create sample grid points for this stand in the Cruise A job. We will simply count all trees and measure every 20th tree counted. Let's go to stand number 3. For this stand, assume that the land slopes up at a bearing of about north 30 degrees east. We will run the cruise lines up and down the slope. The area of the stand is about 70 acres. We would like to put in 27 quarter-acre sample plots in the rectangular pattern. This represents roughly a 10% cruise, with a total of about 7 acres to cruise. We will set the plot lines 10 chains, or 660 feet apart. The line on each side is a distance of 5 chains, or 330 feet away from the exterior boundary. The plots on each line are 2.5 chains, or 165 feet apart. Place their grid origin at the southwest corner of the stand, assuming that it has been tied to the primary control. We will accept the setting of 30 degrees for the orientation field. In the Scale section, enter 660 for the X direction, and enter 165 for the Y direction. Make sure the distances are displayed in feet. Click the Preview button to see the grid mesh. Since we want the lines to be 330 feet from the exterior boundaries, we should move the grid lines along the X direction by that distance. To do so, mark the Offset checkbox, and enter the value 330 into the X Offset Data field. Mark the checkbox for Create Points from Grid. By default, the Grid Points topic is selected as the topic to use. Click the Preview button to see the 27 grid points. Click the OK button to actually create these grid point features in the map. With the Grid Points topic highlighted, I will use the Sheet Setup function to add Position X and Position Y as two additional attributes. When I click OK, the Sheet Setup window closes, and the latitude and longitude of each grid point are displayed in the sheet view. Again, I will select the grid mesh, and use the Cut tool to delete it. For stand number 4, assume that contour lines run in the east-west direction, and that the plot lines will be laid out in the north-south direction. This means we should enter 0 into the orientation field. For this stand, we will create their grid points by using a square pattern. In other words, we want to place their grid points at equal intervals in the X and Y directions. From my calculations, the distance interval is 5 chains. We will offset the plot line by 165 feet. After the grid points have been successfully created, we will delete the grid mesh.